I have the honor of introducing our next speaker, who is Larry Strickling. Larry and I guess, began our relationship on opposite sides of the industry arguments when he was with Ameritech and I was with Teleport. And it was actually, I spent years negotiating and dealing with representatives of all the telephone companies and others at the time. And I have to say, Larry, I enjoyed fencing and dealing and negotiating with Larry more than anybody else because I actually could trust him more than anybody else. Not to imply any other problems, but Larry was quite clear, and he lived up to his promises, and it was a good negotiation, and I learned to respect him. After I left, after Teleport was acquired, Larry was at the FCC, and one day I was at a conference, and I was sitting there amongst a table full of Bell people, and Larry whispered loudly, he said, "How'd you like," he said, "How's working at AT&T?" I said, "Fine." We've been acquired by it. Fine. And then he said, "How'd you like to work at the FCC?" And a pin dropped. I said, "That would be good." And a few weeks later, a month later or so, I joined the FCC, and Larry at that point was the chief of the Comm Carrier Bureau, and I came aboard as deputy. And I have to say, my time at the FCC, being Larry's deputy, was one of the truly highlights of my career. I've had some pretty good times in my career, so I enjoyed working in the government with Larry, and it was just a really great experience. I hope many people, the younger people in the audience, who, if you have an opportunity to do government service, I strongly recommend that you do at some point in your careers, towards the end maybe. But if you do, if you work with people like Larry, government service can really be worthwhile, and quite something to really look forward to. So I urge you to do that. Now Larry is the Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and also the Administrator for NTIA, and heavily involved in a lot of the internet issues and internet governance issues, and I think Larry probably has some fairly interesting things to say, because he usually does. On that note, Larry. Oh, wait.
About Larry. Larry was also a board member of the NTIA. He also, I go back to Harvard Law School, and my wife was the same class, but more particularly Mitt Romney. So Larry's got it kind of all insured. Whatever happens in November, he's okay.
Well, thank you both for those very kind remarks. Not sure which microphone I'm speaking into.
We'll figure this out. Our technical advisor.
Okay. All right. Hey, what do you think about working at NTIA, Bob?
Sure. Wait a minute, are you still going to be there?
I wouldn't ask otherwise. All right, we'll talk later. Well, what Bob didn't tell you, and there's even a better kicker to the story he told, which was that when you come into government, of course, you have to go through this examination of all your financial holdings. Do you mind if I tell this story? Of course, Bob had been made rich beyond his years by the buyout of Teleport by AT&T, and was a little nervous about coming into government and being forced to potentially, in fact, being required to give up that investment, which of course he was projecting would continue to soar, largely on the strength of the assets that AT&T purchased from Teleport. Well, as it turned out, Bob sold at the absolute high of AT&T stock.
The government made me do it. God bless the government.
So yet another benefit of going into the government that you don't always know it and appreciate at the time. But I would like to thank my good friends Ellie and Bob for organizing today's session and inviting me to participate. I always enjoy coming up here, and I, in fact, haven't been able to come the last 2 years. So I had decided months ago that when the invitation came in that I was going to come no matter what, just out of respect for my friends. And of course, today's talk comes at a very important time, so hopefully I'll have something to say on top of it, because there's some very important issues that we are facing right now in the international telecommunications space. And your conference really, I think, sets up the challenge that we're facing, which is trying to deal with these 20th century institutions, particularly as they relate to international telecommunications, and applying them to a 21st century internet space that really defies the kind of categorization that people were able to do back in the 20th century. The one thing I will start with, which shouldn't be any surprise to anyone, is that the United States government is absolutely committed to fighting back proposals to hobble the internet with telephone era regulations. Our goal is to preserve it as a vibrant and growing tool for economic development and social expression. Okay?
Sorry about this. We don't want to miss a single word. All right, I'm now told, can you all hear okay?
It's much better.
Okay. So over the next few months, countries around the world, including the United States, will be considering their positions on very important issues as they prepare for the World Conference on International Telecommunications to be held under the auspices of the International Telecommunication Union in Dubai in December. And there, member countries are going to consider updates to the International Telecommunications Regulations, the ITRs as we call them, a multilateral treaty that governs international telephone traffic. And it should come as no surprise that much is at stake. And today, I'll share why the Obama administration strongly believes that the best way to resolve internet policy issues, including those associated with investments in broadband networks, is through multi-stakeholder processes and not intergovernmental treaties like the ITRs. Now, we all know there's not much that Republicans and Democrats agree on in Washington, but if you've been following this debate, you know that we are united in our embrace of the multi-stakeholder approach for internet policy making. Both party platforms included support for the multi-stakeholder model, and there are now concurrent resolutions in both the House and the Senate that support this approach. Now, I remember when we first started talking about the multi-stakeholder approach several years ago, one of the responses we got from some of our press people, and indeed from reporters themselves, was, what is multi-stakeholder? That's never going to make it. You need to find a different word. But the fact that both party platforms now use the word, I think, demonstrate how far we've come in the last 3 years to demonstrate the importance of the multi-stakeholder process to where people are actually willing to use the term when they write about it in articles. Our support for the multi-stakeholder model of internet policy making is shared by many countries. Last year, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development adopted a set of principles for internet policy making that strongly endorse the multi-stakeholder cooperation. The OECD principles state that multi-stakeholder processes have been shown to provide the flexibility and global scalability required to address internet policy challenges. And just last month, members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization, APEC, endorsed these same principles. So the case for preserving and enhancing the multi-stakeholder model as the preferred tool for dealing with internet policy issues is a strong one. Multi-stakeholder organizations are directly responsible for the internet's success. They have played and continue to play a major role in its design and operation. These processes have succeeded by their very nature of openness and inclusiveness. They are most capable of attacking issues because they can bring the speed and flexibility required in this rapidly changing internet environment. And maintaining and extending this model is important for ensuring the continued growth and innovation in the internet. Now, a key factor in the success of multi-stakeholder processes is participation. The fact that policy development is open to all interested parties. Now, these parties can include industry, civil society, government, technical, academic experts, and even the general public.
So contrast this approach with more traditional telecommunications regulatory processes, which by their very construct have a more limited set of stakeholders and are often designed to limit participation, or at least make it difficult for others to participate. Top-down regulatory models too often can fall prey to rigid procedures, bureaucracy, capture by incumbents, and stalemate. Internet policy issues, on the other hand, draw a much larger range of stakeholders, given that the internet is a diverse, multi-layered system that thrives only through the cooperation of many different parties. Solving policy issues in this space requires engaging these different parties. Indeed, by encouraging the participation of all interested parties, multi-stakeholder processes encourage broader and more creative problem solving. And this is essential when markets and technology are changing as rapidly as they are. Widespread participation by all flavors of stakeholders will be important to the ultimate success of any internet policy initiative. And our role needs to be one of supporting more inclusion and standing firm against the efforts of one faction or another to allow decisions to be made or unreasonably influenced by only certain stakeholders to attempt to tip the outcomes in their favor. So, thank you, David. As we now turn our attention to Dubai in the upcoming WICET conference, the world should evaluate proposals to add to international regulations against the spectacular progress that the internet has experienced. To his credit, Secretary General Torre, who you'll be hearing from this afternoon, has promised to run the WICET on the basis of consensus, and that is as it should be. Given how well the internet has grown and flourished over the years, it should be the burden of any nation seeking to impose new restrictions on the internet, no matter how light the regulatory touch, to have to develop consensus support for such proposals. Now, one suggestion that's raising a lot of discussion is a proposal from the European Telecom network operators, known as ETNO, to assign governments the role of ensuring that service providers provide satisfactory quality of service commitments to each other, and to require providers to negotiate a sustainable system of compensation between providers respecting the principle of sending party pays. And I think you'll hear more about this in the panel following this talk. But let me be clear, the United States government is unequivocally opposed to this proposal for two reasons. First, a treaty conference where only member states have a vote is the wrong place to debate a change of this magnitude to the way the internet operates today. And second, the proposal is a bad idea, a solution in search of a problem, and most likely one that would disadvantage the developing world. On the first point, I've already described the benefits of the multi-stakeholder approach to dealing with internet issues, and contrast that open, inclusive approach with what will happen at the WICET. Only the member states will have a vote. Industry and other organizations may observe and may have a chance to speak, but at the end of the day, this is not a multi-stakeholder process. Moreover, a treaty conference based on regulations written in another era is hardly an appropriate forum to discuss issues that are fundamentally different from the circuit-switched voice telecommunications that were the basis of the 1988 ITRs. You all may remember that the ITU was established as the International Telegraph Union back in 1865 to facilitate the interconnection of nationally administered telegraph networks. As communications evolved, the ITU changed its name and its scope in 1932 to once again facilitate interconnection of national networks, this time the circuit-switched telephone networks based on national borders. Now, the definition of telecommunications used by the ITU was adopted in 1959, more than 50 years ago. And throughout the history leading up to the 1988 conference, the focus was on the exchange of traffic between government-owned or monopoly telephone networks country to country. Now, over time, the relevance of these regulations has dwindled as market conditions have changed. A recent study reported that less than 2% of the international voice traffic of the US is terminated under the traditional settlements arrangements of the ITRs. So here we have a situation where 98%
of this traffic today is exchanged without reference to the ITRs, yet we have a group of incumbent carriers who want to extend this regime to internet traffic. Now, the internet just does not operate under the anachronistic model of monopoly telephone providers that control all aspects of their networks within their countries. Rather, it is a diverse, multi-layered system that thrives only through the cooperation of many different parties. And all of these parties together form the network of networks that we call the internet. But the magic is that the system works without requiring all of these parties to have a commercial relationship with each other, or even to know everyone else involved in a given communication. But just as important as the fact that international treaty organizations, indeed most government bureaucracies, are not engineered to move with such speed and flexibility, in January and February, we saw the ITU hold the World Radio Communication Conference in Geneva. And one of the most hotly debated issues was what should be on the agenda of the next conference in 2015. So do we really want to subject the internet to the global pace of decision-making that takes place in international treaty organizations? Turning to the substance of the proposal, it's simply not a good idea. First, what is the problem the proposal purports to solve? The private negotiations of peering and transit arrangements between providers on the whole has worked pretty well in the absence of international treaty principles. There should be a compelling showing of how the current system is not working before this matter is taken up in treaty negotiations, and that case simply has not been made. Now, it may be the case that the regulatory framework the European carriers live under constrains their returns in a manner that reduces their incentive to invest. I've not studied the matter, and I have no opinion on that. But even if it is the case, that is no justification for upsetting the well-settled internet interconnection regime with a proposal to raise revenues from other providers in the communications pathways. Second, the proposal is a relic of an industry and network structure that just no longer exists. Now, I understand ETNO takes issue with the fact that critics of its proposal have raised the concern that the proposal will impose new burdens throughout the chain of internet connections, reaching both content providers and end users. But that almost certainly will be the case, since any company facing increased costs in the form of an access charge will seek to recover that cost from its customers, including other providers, content creators, and end users. And to think otherwise is to ignore the massive transformation that has occurred in this industry since 1988. Implementing a sending party pays regime would require a cascading series of payments across all involved networks. A new study by Michael Kendi at Analysis Mason demonstrates what's going to happen next. Foreign operators, he says, would likely raise the price of hosting websites serving countries with high settlement rates, which might lead websites to develop less content targeted at a particular country in order to limit their costs. And the news would not be good for developing countries in other ways, as the report concludes that providers would be reluctant to invest in providing infrastructure to a particular country to which it is expensive to deliver traffic. And we haven't even talked about the issue of attempting to meter and bill for this traffic. What happens to network performance if such a system is crafted on the internet, and the likely reduction in overall internet usage that might result? Now, apart from the ETNO proposal, Secretary General Touré has raised the question of the sustainability of the internet and the need for more investment, particularly in developing countries. And that is an important debate we should have. But it should be held in a venue where all stakeholders can participate and where all the issues can be discussed. For example, several months ago, UNESCO, OECD, and the Internet Society released an important study on the relationship between local content, internet development, and access prices. And the report found a strong correlation between the growth of local content and the development of network infrastructure. Now, the study reaches no conclusions as to causality, but if the development of local content is a key factor in growing the internet in developing nations, perhaps the global internet community should be focusing on how to encourage local content development in such countries, not how to gum up the plumbing of the internet. That's not a matter of discussion at the Wicket, and it's not a discussion only governments should have among themselves. Stepping back from the specifics of the ETNO proposal, what the WICET brings into stark relief is the fact that our international institutions designed for a world of monopoly providers respecting national borders do not work well in the borderless, global, multi-layered world of the internet. Now, governments quite naturally are struggling with this in determining how to define their role in this new reality. And it is critical for the future of internet freedom and openness that multi-stakeholder institutions demonstrate to governments that they can be heard and their issues dealt with in the multi-stakeholder process. I believe, and I've said this before, that increasing the meaningful engagement of governments and multi-stakeholder organizations is one of the strongest arguments we have, and indeed is a necessary precondition to opposing the views of some nations to have intergovernmental international bodies replace multi-stakeholder organizations in important areas of internet governance. Now, Secretary General Torre will be here later, and I'm sure he's going to tell you this afternoon that the issues of ICANN and the domain name system are not today on the agenda at WICET. However, this issue has been important to the Obama administration as we think about the idea of enhanced cooperation and finding ways for the global internet community to have a more direct say in matters of internet policy where historically the United States has played a more central role. In fact, we have made great strides in the last 3 years to internationalize ICANN. In 2009, the United States executed the affirmation of commitments with ICANN. This agreement provides a model of enhanced cooperation by establishing mechanisms and timelines for multi-stakeholder review of ICANN's performance of its core tasks. So we expanded what had once been a unique role for the United States government to include the participation of the international community through these review teams. In 2010, I served on the first of the review teams, which focused on evaluating ICANN's accountability and transparency. Our team, which included representatives from the governments of China and Egypt, as well as representatives from South America, Europe, and Australia, made a series of recommendations to the board, all of which the board adopted last year in Singapore. And the new CEO of ICANN, Fadi Shahadi, has committed to complete implementation of all but one of these recommendations by next month's meeting in Toronto, which will provide a good start for the team which begins its work in January. The second team will gear up next January. More recently, we made a concerted effort to employ the principle of enhanced cooperation and expanding international participation in internet governance with respect to the IANA functions contract. Last year, in anticipation of the expiration of the IANA functions contract, NTIA undertook 2 consultations of stakeholders, both domestic and international, on how to best enhance the performance of the functions. Based on input we received from stakeholders around the world, we added new requirements, such as the need for a robust conflict of interest policy, a need to exercise heightened respect for local country laws, and a need to increase transparency and accountability. This spring, we took the unprecedented action of canceling the initial request for proposals because we received no proposal that met the requirements requested by the global community. We then reissued the RFP, and at the end of June, we awarded the contract to ICANN, whose submission in response to the reissued RFP did adequately meet the new global requirements. This contract is consistent with the global community's input and will provide all stakeholders greater visibility into the performance of the IANA functions. One priority task for ICANN and VeriSign will be to automate the root zone management system over the next several months, which will be important as we face the prospect of a large influx of new global top-level domains in the coming months. So this brief summary demonstrates that multi-stakeholder organizations such as ICANN have the ability to move quickly to respond and evolve in response to better meeting the needs of governments without abandoning the model. And it should serve as guidance to all of us as we continue to face calls to regulate the internet through international treaty language. And finally, I'd like to close on a note of caution, again, as we turn our attention to the WICET in Dubai later this year. Earlier this year in July, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a landmark resolution on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet. The Council affirmed that the same rights people have offline must also be protected online, in particular, freedom of expression. Moreover, the Council recognized that the global and open nature of the internet is a driving force towards development. We all need to remember that the issues some countries wish to present at WICIT may be styled as matters of economics, but given how the internet affects so much of our lives, they are just as much matter of human rights and freedom. Last Thursday, I had a chance to hear the president of Estonia, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, speak at the annual Freedom House Awards dinner. Now, his topic was the universals of democracy and despotism, yet he reserved several minutes at the close of his remarks for a discussion of the WICIT. Now, how often would it be that you will hear a president of a country address the WICIT in his remarks? But here's a little of what he said. These are quotes. "The enemies of open society prefer the imposition of a regulatory system on the internet. The authoritarians will present proposals that would undermine the current multi-stakeholder model of the internet, replacing it with a scheme that would allow them to expand control of their own populations and economies, extending their control to undermine the freedom and openness we value today." And he closed with the words, "Let's not let them do it." It's a call to action that the United States and all freedom-loving nations should follow. And take that as my closing remarks, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Got time for?
Sure, we'll take a couple.
Does anybody have any questions? I mean, it's pretty clear, right? Identify yourself, please.
Thank you. Francisco Lozano, Tenure and Ecology LLC. Thank you very much. But couldn't we say that perhaps we're preempting the results of a multi-stakeholder process? And isn't there somewhat of a contradiction when we say, or you say, that human rights could be acceptable as a common standard of freedom of expression? Isn't that already something that we would all agree around, even if the markets move very fast and technology is also moving very fast? Couldn't there be an attempt to coalesce around that? Because that would be a great step forward. And we seem to all agree about human rights playing a key role in international agreement around the internet.
Yeah, I'm not sure where the question was.
Well, the question is,
Nothing he said
couldn't
was-
human rights be a basis for a joint agreement of stakeholder processes that could be somewhat similar to a treaty?
Well, but again, I think we're looking at who is having these discussions and who's making these decisions. So I think the concern about the WICIT is that these are issues that go beyond just economic issues. I think that was the point the president of Estonia was making last week. And again, I think in the context of the entire internet community, these are discussions best held in the multi-stakeholder environment as opposed to in treaty discussions. So I'm not sure that there's really any disagreement between what you're saying and what I'm saying and what the president of Estonia is saying. I think the point is that we just need to acknowledge as we go into this conference that these issues go beyond pure economics.
More?
Sure, David.
David. A question.
Question on who the stakeholders are. Larry, as I spoke to you at lunch, what in the U.S. position on the WICIT is significantly different than, or disagrees with even, the positions being put forward by giant U.S. corporations like Verizon and AT&T?
That's a good question, David. And you did give me a chance to think about it ahead of time. So understand that I'm not fully aware of exactly where we are in some of the positions like mobile roaming and such. Those are evolving through the process. But the issues that I am quite familiar with certainly is the ETNO proposal and the issue of bringing cybersecurity into the ITU. On those issues, I would tell you that we are step by step with AT&T, Verizon, and any other incumbent member of industry, but we're also in step with the Internet Society and anyone else in civil society who's engaged in this issue too. In other words, there's no daylight on those issues between anybody in the United States that I'm aware of who's thinking about these issues, and indeed there's no daylight between Republicans and Democrats on this issue either.
Any more questions? Otherwise, we should. Heather? Would be the last question.
Thank you. Heather Hudson, University of Alaska Anchorage. Thinking back to previous ITU negotiations, something that's puzzled me in hearing comments about how to respond to these proposals is, do you see a strategy to show the ongoing role and importance of the ITU in some matters? Because isn't that part of the, in addition to the specific topics that you raised, what's the role of the ITU, and don't developing country members feel the ITU is an important institution for them? So if we're saying yes, but not for this, is there a win-win approach to doing these negotiations in addition to the specific points that you mentioned?
Well, I think here we have to separate the ITU from the WICA. My comments relate to the use of international treaty negotiations to deal with these issues. They were not intended to, nor should they be interpreted to mean that in any way I'm saying the ITU doesn't play an important role in terms of development issues in Africa and the Middle East and other parts of the world, and that they don't play an important role with respect to spectrum around the world. That's not the challenge in front of us. I think the challenge in front of us, and again, Secretary General Torre is absolutely right to be raising the issue of sustainability of the internet. On that, that's a matter in which we all should have a very important discussion, but that the emphasis has to be on all. It needs to be done in a way where we can get the ideas and the creative thinking of everyone who has something to contribute, as opposed to just member states of the ITU. So, but the Secretary General is right to focus on it, and we need to find a way to have that discussion in the appropriate multi-stakeholder venue.
On that note, I would like to thank Larry for joining us today.